Good afternoon, everyone. I'm now going to move on to talk a little bit about the impacts of climate change on coral reef ecosystems. So I'm a professor at Lancaster University. I've recently returned from about 7 years in Australia, and I've been studying the impacts of climate change on coral reefs for nearly 15 years now. So I'm going to start from the standpoint that maybe some of you in the audience don't know a whole lot about coral reefs. So coral reefs are built by animals. So corals themselves are animals. The tiny polyps, each individual animal, that grow in colonies. So each of those colours and growth forms there is a colony made up of hundreds of different coral animals. And you can see that they have lots of colour, they have lots of structure, and that structure and diversity of habitat enables a huge diversity of other organisms to co-inhabit coral reef ecosystems. They house about 30% of all marine biodiversity. They support the food security and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people throughout the tropics, and they provide important industries such as tourism all around the world. So they're hugely valuable and they're hugely important. But sadly, they're incredibly vulnerable to climate change. So this photo here is of coral bleaching, and I'm sure you've all heard a bit about coral bleaching in the news over the last year or so. So those corals there should be vibrant colours. They're not, they're bleached, they've gone white, that's why we term it bleaching, and I'll very briefly explain what that means. So a healthy coral, in the cartoon on the left there, lives in a symbiotic relationship with single-celled algae. Those algae live within the coral animal tissue and they photosynthesize, and the byproduct of that photosynthesis provides the coral with most of its energy. So the corals are capable of feeding, they filter plankton out of the water, but they also gain a lot of their energy from this symbiotic relationship, and it's a very delicate balance. When corals become stressed, that relationship breaks down. So the coral animal ejects those single-celled algae. Now those algae don't only give the coral its energy, they give it its colour, and that's why we call it coral bleaching, because once the algae have been spat out of the coral animal tissue, the coral animal tissue becomes translucent, and you can see directly through to the calcium carbonate or limestone structure underneath that the coral has been growing. Okay, so the stress that causes bleaching, or most commonly causes bleaching, is heat stress. So corals live within a very narrow thermal tolerance window, and when they become too stressed, and that's typically about 1 degree warmer than the temperature that they've evolved to be used to in that particular location, they bleach. Without those algae, corals can only survive for 4, 5, 6 weeks, and they die of starvation, essentially. They're not getting enough nutrition, the coral animal dies, and that plot on the right there, the dead coral skeleton is now being overgrown by other types of algae that grow over the top of the skeleton, so larger algae. Now, you've heard a lot about coral bleaching over the last few years. There's been a huge coral bleaching event going on. These photos here were taken by a project called the Catlin Sea View of the same reef in 3 different points in time. So on the left, you can see the reef. It's got lots of colour, it's vibrant, there's healthy corals there, providing lots of structure. In the middle, that reef is bleached. So those corals are starving and dying, essentially. And on the right, the same reef has now died. So all those corals are dead. Okay, and we've heard a lot about this. I'm sure you've read lots of news reports about the Great Barrier Reef. It wasn't only the Great Barrier Reef that bleached badly this last couple of years. Lots of nations across the Pacific Ocean lost 80% or more of all of their live coral. Indian Ocean the same, which I'll come to in a moment. So coral bleaching is a story both of warming, which we've just heard a lot about from Joanna, but it's also a story of temperature variability. Okay, so we have background warming, so ocean temperatures are warming gradually, the sea surface temperatures, and then we have these events that cause temperature of the ocean to become very hot very quickly. The most widespread is the El Niño event, which I'm sure many people have heard of. And that occurs when particularly warm water pools in the central and eastern Pacific. So this is a heat map showing particularly warm water in the central and eastern Pacific. Now, El Niño events cause weather patterns to change all over the world. Parts of the Amazon become so dry that they can have wildfires in a rainforest. And you have heavy rainfall elsewhere, such as in Peru on the other side of South America. They also cause seawater temperatures to change all over the world, and many parts of the tropics, including the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean, get incredibly hot. So that's what's happened in 2015 and 2016. There's been this huge El Niño event that's superimposed on already warmer water from gradual global warming, and that's caused a lot of this bleaching. But it's not an entirely new thing. So these El Niño events are natural and have been occurring for some time. But bleaching, we don't have evidence that coral bleaching on the scale we're seeing has occurred before about 1980. Okay, so the first widespread coral bleaching that we witnessed was 1983. The largest by a long shot prior to the one we've just had was in 1998, when there was a huge El Niño event on top of already warmed waters that caused coral bleaching throughout the tropics. So on this map here, the different dates indicate where different locations, different coral reef ecosystems bleached in 1998. So you can see on the Great Barrier Reef off Australia, it was in February. Go across to East Africa there, and it's sort of April, May. Caribbean bleached much later in June and August. So there was global coral bleaching. It's estimated that 16% of live coral around the world died in 1998. And the Western Indian Ocean off East Africa, where I do quite a lot of my work, was particularly badly impacted, where this El Niño aligned with what's called the Indian Ocean dipole event, when warm water is pooling on one side of the Indian Ocean or the other. And it was pooling in the Western Indian Ocean in 98. So these two events happened on top of each other, and the Western Indian Ocean lost nearly 50% of its live coral in that 1 year alone. Okay, so what this allows us to do, and what I'm going to talk about briefly now, is what this meant for coral reefs in that region since 1998, and it foreshadows a little bit what the implications and the long-term trajectories of somewhere like the Northern Great Barrier Reef that's lost so much coral this last year may undergo. So the inner Seychelles was the worst impacted location globally in 1998. We documented a loss of about 90% of live coral from the inner Seychelles. So the reefs there were absolutely devastated. Okay, so if you can imagine snorkeling on a coral reef or diving, which I'm sure many in the room have, it's covered with lots of coral. 95% of that coral just died in 1 year alone. Okay, and that photo at the bottom there was a photo that I took in 2005 of reefs in the Seychelles. Okay, so when I think about coral bleaching, or the science I do around coral bleaching isn't focused on the individual polyps or even the individual colonies of coral. I tend to take an ecosystem perspective. I try and understand what it means for the whole system. In fact, I think about what it means for the social system as well, so fishing communities as well. But a healthy coral reef has lots of structure, lots of live coral, lots of diversity. This is a bleached reef, which I've been talking about. And then following bleaching, if there's lots of mortality, you can have scenarios such as these. Now, both of these photos have very little live coral. They've got about 1% or less live coral. But the reef on the left hasn't lost a lot of its physical structure yet. Okay, so that physical structure that the corals themselves have built provides a lot of the habitat for other fish and organisms to co-inhabit. And if that remains intact for a number of years, a lot of the fish can cope and can survive. On the right, these photos were taken in the same year on different reefs in the Seychelles. That's a reef that's collapsed. So the dead corals have now collapsed into a two-dimensional rubble field, and we documented about 50% of the species of fish on reefs that collapsed had disappeared. So those fish just can't survive. They succumb to predators, so larger fish that feed on them. They can't compete with their competitors, so you have a huge loss in the diversity of the fish communities. I'm going to very quickly tell you about a particular group of fish, if this works. Okay, so these fish we term corallivores, so coral ivores. So they eat coral, so they're coral-feeding fish. They're very small, things like butterfly fish that feed on the coral polyps. They don't tend to damage the corals. They're feeding on mucus and little bits of corals, and they're very colourful and very vibrant fish on reefs. But they're highly dependent on live coral. Now, we can split them up into three different broad groups. In the left-hand bar there, they're facultative corallivores. So they feed on live coral, but they also feed on other things like types of algae, types of invertebrates like marine worms and so on. The middle group are obligate generalists. So they only feed on coral, but they will feed on many different species of coral. And the obligate specialists will only feed on coral, but they will only feed on specific types of coral. Some of them will only feed on 1 or 2 different species of coral, so they're highly specialized. Now I'm going to show you what happened to their populations, their abundances, through that 98 bleaching event in the Seychelles. So these black bars represent the abundances of these different groups of fish in 1994, prior to that bleaching event, and the grey bars are going to be the abundances in 2005, after a lot of the coral died. So the facultative corallivores lost a very small amount of their population. As you can see, the obligate generalists lost a huge number of fish, and the obligate specialists, just move the slide forward, lost almost all of them disappeared. In fact, we documented the local extinction of 4 species of fish that were highly dependent on live coral from the inner Seychelles. So they just couldn't survive because they were completely dependent on these corals that got killed because of climate change. Okay, so we've been going back to the Seychelles now every 3 years, and we've been monitoring what's happening to these reefs to try and foreshadow what the long-term outcomes are of a very severe climate impact to a whole reef system. So we're monitoring 21 different reefs throughout the inner islands of the Seychelles, and we're trying to understand what trajectory they're taking after this big disturbance and why they're taking those trajectories. It was working. Okay, so these 2 photos represent a reef that's been damaged by climate change, and you might imagine that one trajectory could be that corals grow back, they recover. So you get recruitment of new corals, they start growing again and they dominate space. An alternative scenario is that a reef goes on what we term a regime shift. A regime shift is an ecosystem that has shifted to a completely different ecosystem. Okay, so it's no longer a coral-dominated reef, it's shifted to something different. And most commonly, when this occurs on coral reefs, it shifts to seaweeds, so these big, brown, fleshy algae. And when that happens, it's very hard to return a reef that's gone to seaweed back to a coral-dominated reef, because those seaweeds dominate space, they kill corals, most fish won't eat them. So it's a new ecosystem, they go to soft sediment, and it's likely that they're not going to be coral reef ecosystems ever again. Okay, so as I mentioned, we've been looking at 21 reefs in the Seychelles, and we found that 12 of those reefs have recovered quite nicely since the 98 bleaching event through time. So that was a really positive finding, because the inner Seychelles are very isolated. They're right out in the Indian Ocean. They're about 1,000 kilometers off Kenya, so they're quite isolated. So we thought, because they were so badly damaged, that it's very unlikely that these reefs had any capacity to recover. But 12 of them, so over half of the reefs we looked at, bounced back over about a 15-year timescale. On these figures, the blue bars are live coral cover, so hard coral cover, and the green bars, which you can't really see on this particular figure, are these seaweeds, these fleshy, big macroalgae, we call them. The other 9 sites, however, underwent a regime shift. So you can see the blue bars, the coral cover doesn't really come back after the bleaching event from 2005 on. It's bouncing along the bottom, 5, 6, 7% live coral. And those reefs are becoming dominated by these fleshy seaweeds, these algae. It's up at 30, 40%, some reefs at 80% macroalgae. So you dive on these reefs and you've got these big sort of swaying macroalgae, and the system looks very different. This is what it looks like in terms of pictures. So the top 2 photos were taken in 1994 in the inner Seychelles, pretty typical of coral reefs from that part of the Indian Ocean. 2005, I took those photos after the bleaching event. You can see the reefs dead. Some reefs have collapsed, some haven't. There's a diver in that middle right photo, just for scale there. And at the bottom, there's a reef that bounced back and recovered quite nicely in the bottom left, and the reef that's now got lots of this green or brown fleshy macroalgae or seaweeds on it. Now, we wanted to understand why some reefs were able to bounce back and recover and others weren't. That's obviously critical to understand if we're going to think about the future of coral reefs in the face of climate disturbances. So there was 5 factors that became, or we found, were incredibly important for dictating the trajectory that these reefs were taking. One was the nutrient regimes, so how much nutrients were in the water. That's coming off land, most of those nutrients. More nutrients mean that the algae, the seaweeds, can grow more rapidly and outcompete the corals and overcome the reefs. Next was the herbivore biomass, so that's fish that feed on algae. So they control the seaweeds and allow the corals to grow. Next was the structural complexity, the rugosity of the reef. That provides lots of habitat for all the other organisms that provide important processes to help a reef recover. Depth was important. So reefs deeper than about 6 or 7 meters were more likely to recover than reefs that were shallower than that depth. And the juvenile coral density was important, so this replenishment potential. Now, collectively, these factors gave us a 98% predictive capacity to understand why some reefs recovered and others didn't. That's valuable. We can map other reefs and try and understand which are going to be the winners and losers. There's also 2 of those factors, nutrients, so land-based management, and the herbivores, that's fisheries management, that we can do something about at a local level to give reefs a better capacity to bounce back following these big disturbances. Now, very quickly, I'm going to tell you what we found this year. So we went back to these sites in 2017, in April this year. About 6 weeks ago, I returned, and we resurveyed these 21 reefs. Okay, and I'm going to show you 3 very short videos now. So this first one is one of the reefs that was recovering. So this video was in 2011, and sorry, I get distracted by fish, but you can see the coral. Corals are doing quite well there. There's a diversity of growth forms. There's lots of live coral. So that reef is looking quite healthy again. It's recovering. Okay. The next video was taken at the peak of the temperatures in 2016, and you can see that most of these corals are pale or bleached. There's different types of coral there, different growth forms. They're all bleached. Some of them have already died. So those reefs are very stressed. Those corals are very stressed. They're not getting enough nutrition. They're starving. They're dying. Okay? And this final video was taken this year in April. And this is what we found. So most of the reefs have died. So these are the reefs that bounced back and recovered from the big disturbance in '98. All of that coral there is dead. Okay, you can see there's still structure there, and that's because the coral animal, the tissue, has died, and it's left this dead structure there. Now, that structure, those branching corals, that will collapse in about 2 to 3 years' time. So once it's dead, it can't cope with bioerosion, so animals eating at it. It can't cope with wave action as well as when it's alive. So that all of that structure will collapse, and we'll see a big loss of fish that had recovered. These figure just shows coral cover before the bleaching event in '98 and through time after the bleaching event. You can see it's recovering, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, and after this 2016 bleaching event, you can see that coral cover's dropped off again. Now, the key thing here is that it took about 15 years for some of these reefs to bounce back. And that was the time span between these 2 big bleaching events in the Seychelles. But the predictions are that these bleaching events are going to become more and more frequent with the more CO2 and the more global warming we have. So the time span through which corals have to bounce back and recover is going to get shorter, and that's a big problem. Okay, so finally, I just wanted to end with why should we care? Why should you care? And I'm saying this because we're sat in England. We're a long way from most tropical coral reefs. Journalists, when I speak to them, often say, why should we care? Why should our readers care? Why should I run a story about coral reefs? And this is the answer that I've had to learn to say to them, so hopefully they will cover coral reefs. Okay? Hello? So coral reefs are incredibly important in terms of marine biodiversity. So coral reefs, here's a couple of figures. Coral reefs cover less than 0.25% of all of the ocean's area, ocean surface. So tiny area of the oceans, and they house 33% of all marine biodiversity. So anyone who cares about biodiversity, extinctions, needs to worry about the future of coral reefs. In terms of food security, they provide the food security and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people throughout the tropics. So anyone who cares about malnutrition, about food security, about migration issues, needs to be concerned about the future of coral reefs. They're on loan to us from our children, so this is bequest. This is about the idea of looking after our ecosystems for our children. I grew up watching nature documentaries that got me interested in coral reefs, so then I got to dive and snorkel on reefs as a young adult, and now I've got a career in coral reefs. And I want those opportunities to either see live ecosystems like coral reefs on the telly or go and witness them for my own children. So that's a very important thing which obviously we need to think about. And finally, they're worth a huge amount of money. That's for all sorts of things like shoreline protection, which is a really big service that coral reefs provide, like food, like nutrition, like medical advances. It's been estimated that coral reefs are worth $350,000 per hectare per year, which translates to something like $70 billion per year. So they're hugely valuable from an economic sense as well. And with that, I'd like to thank you. I have some questions.